Sometimes I find that my parents learn about scattergrams and they think they know a little more than they do because they don't realize how many exceptions there actually are, or just the things I said right there. Essays, recs, extracurriculars, major. Vince and I know those 4 things are all huge. Not even getting into other things like hooks and interviews, that, an evaluative interview. None of that stuff can be measured by them. Hey, Vince.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great, thanks, my friend. I'm happy to take our listeners through another frequently asked question, the series we're doing, the most commonly asked questions we get on the admission side, on the counseling side. And today we're taking the question on, can I trust scattergrams that you frequently see with SCORE, Naviance? They also see scattergrams on places like niche.com and other ones. Vince, why don't we start by telling our listeners what a scattergram is and then give your thoughts on whether you can trust them.
Sure. So scattergrams can be useful, and typically what they are is they pinpoint based on GPA and testing, or there was a time, during COVID when testing was not available, that you could look at certain GPA sectors, 4.0, over 4.0, 3.5, 3.0, and you could see where students landed. So they would give you a particular school, and you could see all the applicants from your high school who applied to, let's say, Vanderbilt, and went, depending on where the student was, they're usually color coded, and green meant they were admitted. Yellow was waitlisted, and maybe there was an X, red X, for those who were not admitted. So it can help to guide families, students, to get a sense of what to shoot for, whether it was a test score and GPA, what that student looked like. And I think the most important thing is when you were looking at these scattergrams, especially the ones that are related to your high school. So it was really important to know exactly what they were measuring. Was it last year only? Was it the last 3 years? Was it the last 10 years? The more information that's there, the less accurate, to me, it's going to be, or not less accurate, but less essential for you to know. Because if there's 20 years of data in there, and you're looking at somebody who got into Vanderbilt in 2010 with a 3.5, that person isn't going to be admitted in 2026. So you have to know what you're looking at. And that's a really important question. They do typically, I've seen updates both with the scattergrams, where they tell you what they're measuring and what they're including in the profile. I feel like the ones that come from larger sectors, where the information is more general, niche, or, those that where they're saying, if you have this GPA and this SAT, you're more likely to be admitted. I think they're good to get an idea, but I wouldn't, go place a bet on it is what I think. And as long as you know what the criteria is and recognize that some schools, they will sometimes take the outlier out because they don't want families to identify who the person is who's the outlier. So if you haven't, sometimes it can include athletes, it can include development, it can include special talents. So sometimes, if you're looking at NYU, and I remember, this was a long time ago, but I had a student who wasn't UC eligible, and she got into UCLA for acting. That can no longer happen. You have to have a 3.0 to be admitted. But when you have that 3.0, sometimes people can figure out who it is. So sometimes schools will take out outliers to protect the information of the student who applied, especially if it happened recently. Because sometimes at schools, you hear stories about people and everyone's like, huh? Like, how did that happen? And schools will take that information out to protect the students' information.
I have a very nuanced view of scattergrams. It was helpful for you to share the different ways that data is presented. Another one that sometimes is included and sometimes is not is early decision. Sometimes schools indicate if someone was an early decision applicant versus not. For the 200 plus schools that have early decision, incredibly important information. I find they're helpful when there's a large, like you said, school-based is always going to be best because at least some local context is better versus College Board, niche, some of the aggregators out there. Definitely best when there's large numbers versus small numbers, of course. But they're also best when a school is pretty straightforward in their admission process and they're mostly factoring test scores and GPA into consideration. The more a school's taking more holistic factors in, the more variance that you're going to have. And the biggest thing is with hooks, like you said, Some schools remove that, but a lot of schools don't. And so we're going to get more into this in other videos, but completely different standard if you're an institutional priority, if you're a recruited athlete, if you're a donor, if you're a double alum, if you're a faculty kid, if you're a celebrity kid, okay, if you're, as Vince said, high performing art talent, it's going to be in the orchestra or something. That's a different standard.
Hmm.
And so when Julia, one of our co-hosts on Your College Bound Kid, was at Milton Academy, they didn't let students see scattergrams because invariably someone will come down and say, hey, this kid had a 3.2 and they went to Northwestern. So I think I can get in Northwestern, because there's always a bias for people to see what they want to see. And you
Hmm.
couple that with some outliers, and it can
Hmm.
really lead to false expectations. And so I go back to something I've quoted on our podcast a few times. So there's a pretty famous book on writing for the personal statement. It's called On Writing the College Application Essay. And it's by Harry Bald, a school-based counselor in New York City and some very selective schools there. But he was also on the admissions side, both at Brown and Columbia. And one of the things Harry says in his book, and I've often said this to students, and Vince gets this, Vince has done admissions at multiple places. There's basically two types of applicants, and you go into one of two buckets. And he calls those that have a built-in lobbyist,
Hmm.
and we're talking like recruited athletes, right? We're talking about donors. We're talking about faculty kids, celebrity kids, double alum legacy, especially if they've been contributors in active or even one legacy. And there could be some other things as well. It could be very unique compositional diversity that's very hard for the school to attract. So that's what he calls, you've got a built-in lobbyist in the admission office. A lot of times there'll be a third committee that will read that file specifically. You got places like Williams, or if you're a legacy, you go right to special committee and it gets reviewed and that kind of thing. And then he says, everybody else is just folks.
Hmm.
And if you're in the just folks bucket, you have to understand it is not the same bar, because you're not meeting a unique need of the school. Now, an illustration I've used on the podcast events is I'm hiring and I have a problem. We have a shortage of waitresses and waiters, and our restaurant's open from 11 to 11. Okay. And we really need to hire about eight people. We're understaffed, and I get 50 incredible applicants for the job. However, I'm really short from 11 to 2 a.m., 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., and from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. But a lot of the extraordinary people that I get are applying, and they're available in that 2 to 8 range. I'm already okay there. So who am I going to go for? I'm going to go for the people that meet my needs. Well, that's how schools see institutional priorities, right? You're meeting their
Yes.
needs. And so
Yes.
they're going
Yes.
to go for the person that's available when they need the service, when they need people. And that's kind of how schools see institutional priorities. And so that's one of the problems I have with scattergrams is they don't show the outliers
Mm.
most of the time. I know sometimes people pull them, but most of the time I find they don't, or they don't pull them all, and they can give people false hope. The other thing it can't say is the role your major played. And major, we know, can play a huge role in admissions. Okay. It also doesn't say anything about your extracurriculars or your writing or your recs,
Hmm.
all of which can play a really, really big role.
Hmm.
So what I find helpful is to look at trends. When I see a lot of decisions from a school and you can kind of look at it and you see some pattern recognition, that can be helpful. Like you might look at a bunch of applicants to UNC out of state and be like, man, nobody got in that didn't have a 1450 SAT.
Right.
That's something you should take note of.
Yep.
So they can be helpful on some level. Sometimes I find that my parents learn about scattergrams and they think they know a little more than they do, because they don't realize how many exceptions there actually are, or just the things I said right there: essays, recs, extracurriculars, major. Vince and I know those 4 things are all huge. Not even getting into other things like hooks and interviews that, there's an evaluative interview. None of that stuff can be measured by them. So they are useful. I actually have it for all of my clients I work with. I have a checklist of things to submit. And I do ask for like Naviance and score logins and if stuff people have them, because I will go in and study them and pick some patterns and things up. So they're absolutely worth consulting, but you have to realize they're not gospel and there are exceptions. And just don't take too many inferences from them. Definitely don't get any confidence from the outliers. No, the outliers are outliers for a reason. They usually met some unique need of the school, and therefore they're willing to go outside of their profile to admit a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's clear to everybody that they're an outlier. Like nobody, admissions wise, college counselor isn't surprised by that. None of that happens. So I think, or the school counselor isn't surprised. And often the student who it impacted in the family, they understand that. And now they may be mysterious about it, but they don't say anything. So anyway, the school counselor, the family where they were impacted, admitted, they will know, but they may not be public in sharing that information, or they may be very public and everyone understands. But and then when students look at it, they're like, well, where's this person? And the counselor will say, we take some students out of the scattergram.
Yeah. So use them, but use them with caution. And one tool in the toolkit.
There you go.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, Vince.
Thank you.